Right now, as you're listening to this, you're standing on the grave of a world you never knew existed. Buried beneath every city, every highway, every field of wheat, there might be the ruins of a civilization so advanced that, when it died, we forgot it was even possible. The history books tell us a simple story. Humans were primitive for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, about 10,000 years ago, we figured out farming. We built cities. We invented writing. And that's where civilization began. First time, clean start. But here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. That story has holes in it. Big ones. And those holes are filled with stone blocks that shouldn't exist, myths that match geological records, and engineering that we still can't explain. So tonight, we're going to look at something different. Not aliens, not fantasy, just evidence. The kind that makes you wonder if the ground beneath your feet is hiding something we were never supposed to forget. We grow up learning history like it's a straight line. Stone Age leads to Bronze Age, leads to Iron Age, leads to us. Progress, always forward, never back. It's a comforting idea because it means we're special. We're the peak, the first ones to really figure it all out. But that model requires you to ignore some really strange things. Like the fact that in Egypt, there are granite boxes buried underground that are machined to tolerances we struggle to match with modern computers. And they're dated to a time when, supposedly, the Egyptians were using copper chisels and stone hammers. Or the fact that nearly every ancient culture on Earth, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all tell the same story. A great flood, a lost golden age, gods who came from the sea to teach them everything they know. Or the fact that massive stone structures exist at the bottom of our foundations, that the cultures who built on top of them swore they didn't create. The Incas looked at the megalithic walls beneath Cusco and said, "Giants built that, not us." For a long time, historians dismissed all this as coincidence, primitive legends, exaggeration. But geology doesn't exaggerate, and the geological record shows something that changes everything. About 12,800 years ago, something catastrophic happened to this planet. Something so violent that it reset the entire surface world. And if there was a civilization before that moment, almost everything they built would be exactly where we're not looking. Underwater. Let's go back to that moment, 12,800 years before now. The Earth was coming out of an ice age. The glaciers were retreating. The world was warming. If you were alive then and you looked at the coastlines, they would be completely unrecognizable to you now. Sea levels were 120 meters lower. That's almost 400 feet. The land we call Indonesia today, it wasn't a bunch of islands. It was a continent. A massive landmass called Sunderland, bigger than modern Europe, covered in rivers and forests and coastline. Doggerland connected Britain to mainland Europe as a vast, lush plain. The Persian Gulf was a valley, not water, fed by 4 great rivers. These were the prime real estate areas of the world, coastal, fertile, temperate. If an advanced civilization existed back then, this is where they would have lived. Not in the mountains, not in the frozen north, but on the coasts. And then the sky caught fire. Around 12,800 years ago, something entered Earth's atmosphere. Based on the geological evidence, it was likely a fragmented comet, several kilometers across, breaking apart as it hit. We're talking about multiple airbursts, each one releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs. The evidence for this is everywhere once you know where to look. In North America, Europe, and the Middle East, there's a layer of sediment called the black mat. It's a dark band of charcoal and soot that marks a specific moment in time. Inside that layer, scientists have found shocked quartz. That's quartz that's been subjected to pressures so extreme they only occur in 2 scenarios: nuclear explosions or cosmic impacts. They've found platinum spikes. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust but common in comets. The concentration of platinum in this boundary layer is off the charts. They found nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that only form under temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius. And they found melt glass, soil that's been superheated and vitrified into glass, scattered across multiple continents. This wasn't a volcano. This wasn't a forest fire. This was something from space, fragmenting and detonating across the atmosphere in a chain of airbursts that ignited up to 10% of the planet's biomass. Imagine it, the sky turning orange, shockwaves flattening forests, wildfires spreading faster than anything could run, the smoke and ash rising into the stratosphere, blocking out the sun for months, maybe years. This triggered what's called an impact winter. Temperatures plummeted. The warming trend of the previous few thousand years reversed in a geological heartbeat. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it lasted for 1,200 years. 12 centuries of bitter cold, collapsing ecosystems, megafauna dying off by the dozens. In North America alone, 35 genera of large animals went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, ground sloths, and along with them the Clovis people, one of the most sophisticated hunter-gatherer cultures in the archaeological record, just vanished. If there was a civilization on those coastal plains when this happened, the immediate thermal devastation would have been catastrophic. But it gets worse. Because when the Younger Dryas finally ended 11,600 years ago, it didn't end gently. The cold snap broke suddenly. The ice sheets that had been stable for over 1,000 years started collapsing, fast. This is where we get into something called meltwater pulse, 1B. Between 11,600 and 11,300 years ago, global sea levels rose by at least 13 meters. That's over 40 feet. And this didn't happen gradually over centuries. Geological evidence suggests it could have occurred in decades, maybe even years. Think about what that means. You're living on a coastal plain. It's been your home, your ancestors' home, for generations. You have cities, farmland, ports. Then the ocean starts rising, not slowly, fast enough that you can watch it happen, fast enough that you can't move entire populations inland in time. The water doesn't stop, it keeps coming. It swallows the lowlands first, then the valleys, then the coastal plateaus. Everything within 100 miles of the old shoreline is gone, drowned, buried under silt and sediment. This wasn't a myth. This was a real, documented geological event, and it erased nearly 2 million square kilometers of inhabited land. Sundaland, that massive tropical continent in Southeast Asia, was reduced to the scattered islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. The most fertile, biodiverse region on the planet, home to potentially millions of people, was wiped off the map. Doggerland, the heart of northern Europe, became the floor of the North Sea. Entire Mesolithic settlements, complete with tools, animal remains, and evidence of fishing communities, now lie under cold, dark water, occasionally dredged up by fishing trawlers who don't even realize what they're pulling out of the nets. The Persian Gulf oasis, that fertile river valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, flooded completely. It's now a shallow sea, and according to some researchers, the survivors of that flooding were forced inland into Mesopotamia, appearing suddenly in the archaeological record with an already developed culture, the Sumerians. Which brings us to something interesting. The Sumerians didn't claim to have invented civilization. They said it was taught to them by the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea after a great flood. Not gods, not spirits, but beings who brought knowledge of agriculture, architecture, writing, and law. And that story, that specific story, appears everywhere. There are over 500 flood myths recorded across human cultures. 500. From the Epic of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia, to the story of Noah in the Bible, to the Hindu account of Manu, to the Greek myth of Deucalion, to indigenous legends in Australia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. They all describe the same thing: a catastrophic flood, a warning from a divine figure, the construction of a vessel, a small group of survivors, the repopulation of the Earth, and often the loss of a previous, more advanced world. For a long time, scholars assumed these were just stories, cultural archetypes, coincidences. But here's the thing about coincidences. When they match geological data, they stop being coincidences. The flood myths describe water rising and covering the land. Meltwater Pulse 1b did exactly that. The myths describe a time of darkness and cold before the flood. The Younger Dryas was exactly that. The myths describe gods or sages who survived the catastrophe and taught the survivors how to rebuild. If there was a previous civilization, its remnants, the people who had the knowledge, would have done exactly that. They would have tried to pass on what they knew to the hunter-gatherer populations that survived in the highlands. And this is where things get really interesting. Because across the world, in cultures that never had contact with each other, there's a recurring figure, the civilizing hero, the teacher from the sea. In Mesopotamia, it's Ons, described as a being with the body of a fish but a human head and feet beneath. He emerged from the Erythraean Sea, which is the Persian Gulf, every morning and taught the people agriculture, writing, and architecture. Then, at night, he returned to the water. Now, if you strip away the mythological language, what are you left with? A survivor from the flooded Persian Gulf oasis, possibly using some kind of waterproof garment or diving gear, misunderstood by people who had never seen anything like it, teaching them the knowledge of a lost world. In South America, it's Viracocha, described as a tall man with pale skin and a beard, wearing white robes. He appeared after a time of darkness, traveled through the Andes teaching the people how to farm, how to build, how to organize society. Then he walked into the Pacific Ocean, promising to return. In Mesoamerica, it's Quetzalcoatl or Cuculcan, the feathered serpent, bringer of maize, the calendar, writing, metallurgy, also described as a bearded figure who came from the sea and eventually departed back across the water. In India, the Vedic texts speak of the Saptarishi, the 7 sages who preserved knowledge through a cosmic catastrophe and re-established civilization in the next age. In Egypt, the building texts of Edfu describe the 7 sages who founded the sacred sites along the Nile before the flood. 7 sages, over and over, different continents, different languages, different eras, same story. This isn't mythology. This is cultural memory, the memory of survivors, remnants of an older world desperately trying to pass on what they knew before they died, and that knowledge died with them. And you can hear the desperation in these myths if you read them carefully. These weren't gods enjoying their power. These were teachers who knew they were running out of time. The hardware, stone doesn't lie. Now myths are one thing, geological records are another. But the hardest evidence, the stuff you can touch and measure and analyze, is the stonework. Because if this lost civilization existed, and if it was advanced, the only thing that would survive 12,000 years of erosion, flooding, and burial would be the largest and most precisely made stone structures. And those exist. They're just in places we're not supposed to ask questions about. Let's start in Egypt. Beneath the sands of Saqqara, there's a complex called the Serapeum. It's a series of underground tunnels carved out of bedrock, and inside these tunnels are 24 enormous stone boxes. Each one weighs between 70 and 100 tons. The lids alone weigh up to 30 tons. They're made of Aswan granite. That's one of the hardest stones on Earth, measuring between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Now here's what makes these boxes impossible to explain. The interior surfaces are flat to within 2/10,000ths of an inch. That's 0.0002 inches. That's a fraction of the width of a human hair. The corners are perfectly square. The walls are parallel to a degree of precision that would be difficult to achieve today without computer-controlled machining. Why would anyone do this? The standard explanation is that these boxes were sarcophagi for sacred bulls. But if you're building a coffin for a bull, why would you need optical-grade flatness on the inside surfaces? Why would you need tolerances that tight? It doesn't make sense functionally, which suggests the function wasn't what we think it was. And here's the other problem. These boxes are located in tunnels so narrow that there's barely 2 feet of clearance on either side. The conventional explanation is that they were dragged in on wooden rollers by hundreds of men pulling ropes. But there's no room. You can't fit the teams of people required to move a 100-ton object through a space that tight. The physics doesn't work. The logistics doesn't work. So either they had a technology we don't understand, or they were placed there before the tunnels existed, which raises even stranger questions about the age and purpose of the entire complex. Now let's go to the Giza Plateau. In the late 1800s, the archaeologist Sir William Flinders Petrie discovered a series of granite drill cores at Giza. These are cylindrical pieces of granite that were drilled out, presumably to create holes for some kind of construction purpose. One core in particular, labeled core number 7, has baffled engineers for over a century. It has a spiral groove on its surface, a continuous thread like a screw. This groove indicates the path of whatever tool was cutting into the granite as it rotated. The spacing of the groove suggests that the drill was penetrating the granite at a rate of 1/10 of an inch per revolution. Now, modern diamond-tipped core drills, spinning at 900 rotations per minute and using industrial pressure, penetrate granite at a rate of about 2/10,000ths of an inch per revolution. That means the ancient Egyptian drill, whatever it was cutting into granite 500 times faster per rotation than modern equipment. Hell, the standard explanation is that they used a copper tube with sand and water as an abrasive, rotated by hand. Experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate Core 7 using this method. They can drill granite, but the cores they produce don't match. The striations are irregular. The groove isn't continuous. And most importantly, in their replicas, the softer feldspar in the granite wears away faster than the harder quartz, which is what you'd expect with a loose abrasive. But on Core 7, the quartz is cut deeper than the feldspar. That's backwards. That suggests a fixed cutting tool of extreme hardness, applying tremendous pressure, not a loose slurry of sand. So what were they using? We don't know, and that's the point. The evidence suggests a technology that doesn't fit the timeline. Now let's go to Peru. In the highlands above Cusco, there's a site called Sacsayhuaman. It's described as an Inca fortress, and the upper sections probably were built by the Inca. They're made of small, rough-cut stones held together with clay mortar, standard construction for that period. But the foundation is something else entirely. The foundation consists of limestone blocks weighing up to 120 tons, fitted together in a polygonal style so precise that you can't insert a razor blade between them. No mortar, no gaps, just stone nested against stone in three-dimensional interlocking patterns. These aren't stacked, they're woven. Each block has multiple irregular faces that mate perfectly with the surrounding blocks. It's like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle made out of stone that weighs more than a commercial airliner. And this design isn't decorative, it's functional. It makes the walls virtually earthquake-proof. When seismic waves hit, the stones shift slightly and then resettle, distributing the energy. Spanish colonial buildings in Cusco collapsed during earthquakes. The Sacsayhuaman foundations didn't move. Now here's the thing. The Spanish chroniclers who arrived shortly after the conquest wrote that the Inca themselves claimed they didn't build the megalithic sections. They said it was the work of an earlier race, giants, or gods, depending on how you translate the word. The Inca were incredible engineers. They built Machu Picchu. They built an empire connected by thousands of miles of roads. They weren't primitive. But when asked about the massive polygonal masonry, they said, "That wasn't us." Many of these stones also have strange knobs or protrusions on them. The standard explanation is that these were used to tie ropes for lifting. But that doesn't make sense either, because the knobs are often at the bottom of the stones, which would create an unstable lifting point. And they're still present on stones that have been finished and polished, which means they should have been removed if they were just temporary aids. Some researchers have pointed out that some of these surfaces have a vitrified, almost glassy texture, and that the stones have a rounded, almost pillowy appearance in places, as if they were softened or molded rather than cut. We don't have the technology to mold stone, but somebody did, or at least that's what the evidence suggests. Let's go to Lebanon. At Baalbek, there's a Roman temple complex built on top of a foundation that predates the Romans by an unknown amount of time. The Romans built beautiful temples there. Columns, courtyards, intricate carvings. Standard Roman architecture. But the platform they built it on consists of 3 stones, called the trilithon, each weighing roughly 800 tons. These stones are lifted 6 meters into the air and placed with such precision that you can't fit a piece of paper between them. The Romans moved heavy objects. They moved obelisks weighing 300 to 500 tons. That's well documented. But 800 tons is a different scale entirely. And there's no Roman record of moving the trilithon stones, even though they meticulously documented all their major engineering achievements. In the nearby quarry, there are even larger stones. The stone of the pregnant woman weighs about 1,000 tons, and recently, another stone was uncovered that weighs an estimated 1,650 tons. These stones were cut, they were shaped, but they were never moved, which raises the question who was planning to move them, and how. The contrast between the ornate Roman temple sitting on top of this massive, ancient platform is stark. It's like building a wooden shed on top of the foundation of a skyscraper. It doesn't match. One more site, India. In the Barabar Hills, there's a series of caves carved out of solid granite. They're dated to around 300 BCE, which places them in the Mauryan period. But the level of precision in these caves is off the charts. The walls are polished to a mirror finish. You can see your reflection in them. Laser scans have shown that the surfaces deviate from a perfect plane by only millimeters over distances of 10 meters. But here's the real trick. These aren't flat walls. They're vaulted ceilings, concave surfaces. Polishing a flat granite surface is hard enough. Polishing a curved surface to a mirror finish without distorting the geometry requires maintaining a perfect radius across the entire surface. How do you do that? With a rotating jig or some kind of template system that can hold tolerances across meters of stone. That's not something you do with hand tools and sandpaper. And the acoustic properties of these caves are remarkable. The shape and polish of the surfaces create specific resonance patterns that amplify certain frequencies. These weren't just carved for aesthetics. They were engineered for sound. Stone doesn't lie. You can dismiss myths. You can argue about dating. But you can't argue with physics. These structures exist. They're real. And the level of engineering they represent doesn't fit neatly into the accepted timeline of human technological development. Which brings us back to the central question. If humans were supposed to be transitioning from hunter-gatherers to early farmers during this period, how were they producing stonework that we can barely replicate with modern machinery? Unless they weren't the first ones to figure this out. The inheritance model, REBULDNG on RUNS. Here's what the evidence suggests when you put it all together. Around 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, a civilization existed. Not in the frozen north, not in the high deserts, but on the coastal plains that are now underwater. They were maritime. They understood navigation, astronomy, engineering. They worked stone with a precision that implied advanced tools, possibly involving high-pressure water cutting, ultrasonic drilling, or methods we haven't rediscovered yet. They built structures that were meant to last, massive foundations, precisely engineered chambers, things that could survive geological catastrophe. Then, 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas impact event hit. The airbursts devastated the surface. The impact winter collapsed the agricultural system. Populations that had been concentrated in cities were scattered. 1,200 years of cold fragmented what was left. Knowledge was lost. Specialized craftsmen died without passing on their skills. The population bottlenecked. Then, 11,600 years ago, when the cold finally broke, the meltwater pulses flooded the coastal homelands. Everything that had survived the impact was drowned. The cities, the ports, the centers of population, gone. What was left were the highlands, the mountains, and the people who had fled there. Most of them were probably not the urban elites. They were the survivors, the refugees, the people who had just enough knowledge to remember that things used to be different. And some of them, the ones who had been engineers, astronomers, architects, teachers, tried to preserve what they could. They sought out the populations of hunter-gatherers who had survived in the interior, and they taught them. Agriculture, architecture, writing, astronomy, all the foundational technologies that supposedly emerged spontaneously and independently in multiple locations around the world within a very narrow window of time. But it wasn't spontaneous. It was taught by the remnants of a previous world. And as those survivors died, their students, who didn't fully understand the depth of what they'd been taught, mythologized them. They became gods. They became heroes. They became legends. But the structures they built, the ones that were meant to survive, those stayed. Buried, underwater, or sitting in plain sight, misattributed to later cultures who built on top of them. This is the inheritance model. We didn't start from scratch. We started from fragments. And we've spent the last 10,000 years trying to put the pieces back together, not realizing we're rebuilding something that already existed. The evidence we're not looking at. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Less than 1% of the continental shelf has been surveyed for archaeological remains. 1%. Marine archaeology is expensive. It's difficult. It requires specialized equipment, trained divers, and years of funding. Most archaeological resources are focused on land sites because they're accessible. But if you were looking for a pre-Ice Age civilization, you're looking in the wrong place. The high ground of the Pleistocene is the hinterland of today. The coastlines were where people lived, and those coastlines are now under 120 meters of water. The few times we've actually looked underwater in the right places, we've found things. Off the coast of India, near Gujarat, sonar surveys have detected massive geometric structures on the ocean floor, stone formations that appear to be walls, foundations, and grid patterns. They're dated, based on the surrounding sediment, to around 9,000 years ago. That's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than any major land-based civilization. Off the coast of Japan, there's the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater structure with flat platforms, right-angle corners, and step pyramids. Geologists argue about whether it's natural or artificial, but even if it's partially natural, there's clear evidence of human modification. Tool marks, carved channels, deliberate shaping. In the Mediterranean, entire Roman and Greek cities have been found underwater, which makes sense because we know those civilizations existed, and we know sea levels have changed even in historical times. But deeper, older structures keep turning up that don't fit. And then there's the Black Sea. Recent research has shown that the Black Sea was a freshwater lake until around 7,600 years ago, when rising sea levels in the Mediterranean caused a catastrophic flood that filled the basin in a matter of months. Underwater surveys have found preserved coastlines, riverbeds, and structures that were submerged in that flood. If people were living there before, and they probably were because it was prime real estate, an entire regional civilization would have been wiped out in weeks. This is the problem. We're writing the history of humanity based on the small percentage of the planet we can easily access. But the most important evidence might be in the places we're not looking. Underwater, buried under meters of silt, or hidden beneath modern cities that were built on top of ancient sites, layer after layer, tell mound upon tell mound. The cycle, it's happened before, it will happen again. There's another pattern here that's worth talking about, the idea of cyclical collapse and recovery. If you look at the archaeological record, civilizations don't just rise, they rise and fall. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE wiped out multiple advanced societies across the Mediterranean and Near East. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks collapsed. Cities were abandoned. It took centuries to recover. The fall of Rome plunged Europe into a period where technologies that had been common, like concrete and aqueducts, were forgotten. The recipe for Roman concrete, which could set underwater and last for thousands of years, was lost. We only rediscovered how to make it in the modern era by analyzing the original structures. Greek fire, the Byzantine weapon that could burn on water and couldn't be extinguished, was lost. We still don't know exactly how to make it. Damascus steel, which could hold an edge better than any modern steel and had a distinctive wavy pattern, was lost. We can approximate it, but we don't know the exact process. These are just from historical periods where we have written records and a continuous chain of civilization. Things were forgotten even when people were trying to remember them. Now imagine a collapse far worse. A collapse so complete that it erases not just the knowledge but the memory of the knowledge. A collapse where the survivors are so scattered and traumatized that they can't maintain the infrastructure, the education, the specialization required to keep the technology alive. That's what a global catastrophe does. It resets everything. And the thing about geological catastrophes is that they're not rare. They're cyclical. Supervolcanic eruptions happen roughly every 100,000 years. Major asteroid impacts happen on similar timescales. Rapid climate shifts, like the Younger Dryas, happen every few tens of thousands of years. We're living in a period of unusual stability. The Holocene, the last 11,700 years, has been remarkably calm. Stable climate, predictable seasons. It's the longest period of stability in the last 100,000 years. But that stability is an anomaly. It's not the norm, and it won't last forever. Which means that if a previous civilization was wiped out by a catastrophe, there's no reason to assume we're immune. In fact, we're probably due. The philosophical weight, species amnesia. Here's the part that keeps me up at night. If this hypothesis is true, if there was a global civilization before us that was erased by a cosmic impact and a flood, then we're not the first. We're not special. We're not the apex of human achievement. We're the recovery. We're the descendants of traumatized survivors who spent 10,000 years crawling back from the edge of extinction, slowly, painfully relearning things that were once common knowledge. And we don't remember. We have no cultural memory of it beyond distorted myths that we've dismissed as fantasy. That's what I mean by species amnesia. We've forgotten our own history, not the history of a nation or a culture, but the history of the species, the full depth of what we've been through. And if we don't remember, we can't learn from it. Every culture on Earth has flood myths. Every single one. That's not mythology. That's collective trauma. That's the genetic memory of our ancestors watching their world drown. And what did they do? They encoded the memory into stories. They passed it down. They tried to warn us. But we stopped listening. We called it myth. We filed it under primitive superstition and moved on. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that we lost the civilization, but that we lost the warning. The gods were dying. Here's another angle that makes this story even more tragic. If the survivors of the old world, the ones with the knowledge, tried to teach the post-catastrophe populations how to rebuild, then they were racing against time. Because they were dying. Think about it. You're one of maybe a few hundred people left who understands advanced engineering. You know how to work stone with precision. You know how to navigate by the stars. You know mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy. But you're getting older, and the people around you, the ones you're trying to teach, don't have the educational foundation you had. They didn't grow up in cities with schools and libraries. They grew up hunting and gathering. They're smart, they're capable, but they're starting from scratch. So you teach them what you can. You show them how to plant crops, how to build shelters, how to read the stars. You do your best. But you can't teach them everything. There's not enough time. And some things require infrastructure you no longer have. You can't teach advanced metallurgy without a functional forge. You can't teach maritime navigation without ships. So you focus on the basics, the things they'll need to survive. And you hope that maybe, someday, their descendants will build on what you taught them and rediscover the rest. And then you die. And with you dies a little more of the old world. Now imagine that happening over and over, generation after generation, each one losing a little more, each one further from the source. Eventually the teachers become legends, then gods, then myths. And the knowledge becomes ritual, ritual without understanding. People perform the actions because that's what the ancestors taught, but they've forgotten why. That's how you get cargo cults. That's how you get megalithic structures that later cultures revere but can't replicate. That's how you get myths about gods who brought civilization and then left. The gods didn't leave. They died, and we forgot they were ever real. The evidence beneath our feet. Tell MOUNDS and layered CITIS. There's another piece of evidence that's hiding in plain sight. The way cities are layered. In the Middle East, there are these things called tell mounds. They're artificial hills, sometimes 30 or 40 meters high, made entirely of compressed layers of human habitation. How do they form? Simple. You build a city. Mud brick walls, wooden structures. Eventually the buildings decay, or there's a fire or a war, or people just move away. The structures collapse. Over time they compact into a layer of debris. Then decades or centuries later, a new group of people comes along. They see a flat, raised area with good drainage, and they build on top of the ruins. Their city eventually collapses or is abandoned. Another layer. This happens over and over for thousands of years. Each new city built on the bones of the previous one. And if you dig down through these tell mounds, you can read the history like tree rings. The oldest layers at the bottom, the newest at the top. Here's the thing. When archaeologists excavate these tells, they find something strange. The deeper you go, the more sophisticated the construction sometimes becomes. You'd expect the opposite, right? Primitive at the bottom, advanced at the top. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes the lowest levels, the oldest levels, show evidence of better urban planning, more advanced drainage systems, more sophisticated tool use than the layers above them. It's as if the people at the bottom knew more than the people who came later. This pattern shows up at site after site. Saddlehuruk in Turkey, the Indus Valley cities, Mesopotamian sites. You dig down expecting to find progressively simpler structures, and instead you find evidence of sudden, fully formed urban planning that doesn't have a clear developmental pathway. The Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological record around 5,000 years ago, seemingly out of nowhere, with writing, mathematics, law codes, and urban infrastructure already in place. There's no long period of gradual development visible in the record. It's as if they started at a high level and built from there. The standard explanation is that we just haven't found the earlier transitional sites yet, which is possible. But another explanation is that they were taught by people who already knew how to do these things, people who had done them before. The alternative explanation, why this isn't mainstream. Now, you might be wondering, if all this evidence exists, why isn't this the mainstream view? There are a few reasons. First, academic momentum. The current model of history has been taught for over a century. It's in every textbook. It's the foundation of careers, publications, funding. Changing a foundational narrative like that is not just difficult, it's threatening. If you're a tenured professor who's published 20 papers based on the conventional timeline, and someone comes along with evidence that the timeline is wrong, you're not going to embrace it. You're going to defend your work. That's not malice. That's human nature. We all resist evidence that undermines our worldview. Second, the evidence is scattered and incomplete. There's no single smoking gun. There's no ancient library that survived intact with blueprints and instruction manuals. What we have are anomalies. Stone blocks that shouldn't be that precise. Myths that match geological events a little too well. Sites that are older than they should be. Individually, each piece of evidence can be explained away or dismissed. It's only when you step back and look at the pattern as a whole that it becomes compelling. And most people, including most academics, work within narrow specializations. The geologist knows about the Younger Dryas impact, but doesn't study Egyptian stonework. The Egyptologist knows about the Serapeum, but doesn't study paleoclimatology. The mythologist knows about flood myths, but doesn't study marine archaeology. Nobody's looking at all of it together, except for a handful of researchers, who are often dismissed as fringe because they're crossing disciplinary boundaries. Third, there's a philosophical resistance. The idea that we're not the first, that we're rebuilding on ruins, is unsettling. It means we're not as special as we thought. It means history is fragile. It means everything we've built could be erased by forces beyond our control. That's not a comfortable thought, so we don't think it. But discomfort doesn't make something untrue. The testing, how we could prove or disprove this. Here's the good news. This hypothesis is testable. If a pre-Younger Dryas civilization existed, certain things would be true. 1. There would be megalithic structures or foundations beneath known historical sites that predate those sites by thousands of years. We're already finding this. The Sphinx enclosure shows water erosion that geologists say requires thousands of years of rainfall, which hasn't occurred in Egypt since before the current arid period began. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to 9,600 BCE, thousands of years before agriculture was supposed to exist, and it's so sophisticated that the builders buried it deliberately, which suggests they knew it wouldn't last otherwise. 2. There would be evidence of sudden technological knowledge appearing in multiple locations around the same time with no clear developmental pathway. We see this with the Neolithic Revolution. Agriculture appears in multiple places, seemingly independently, within a narrow window after the Younger Dryas. Writing appears in Sumer and Egypt around the same time. Advanced urban planning appears suddenly in the Indus Valley. 3. There would be shared mythological motifs across geographically separated cultures that match real geological events. We have this. Flood myths, 7 sages, gods from the sea, all of them clustering around the same time period and describing the same events. 4. There would be submerged structures on continental shelves that show signs of human construction. We're starting to find these off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, but we've barely scratched the surface. 5. There would be advanced tool marks or construction techniques on ancient stone that exceed the capabilities of the cultures they're attributed to. The Giza drill cores, the Serapeum boxes, the precision polygonal masonry in Peru, all of these fit. So the evidence is there. What we need is more funding for marine archaeology, more interdisciplinary research, more willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Because if this is true, it changes everything. It means our history books are incomplete. It means the timeline of human achievement needs to be rewritten. And it means we need to take the warnings encoded in ancient myths seriously. Because the catastrophes that erase the previous world are not unique, they're cyclical, and we're not immune. The rebirth, we're not building, we are rebuilding. There's one more layer to this that I find both tragic and hopeful. If we're the inheritors of a lost world, if we're rebuilding on ruins, then every technological breakthrough we celebrate might just be us remembering. The Renaissance didn't invent knowledge, it rediscovered it. They found Roman texts, Greek manuscripts. They translated them, studied them, and rebuilt European civilization on that foundation. But what if the Romans and Greeks were doing the same thing? What if they were rediscovering knowledge from an even earlier source? Plato wrote about Atlantis. He described it as a story told to the Greek statesman Solon by Egyptian priests, who said it was ancient even to them. 9,000 years before Solon's time, they said, which would place it right around the younger Dryas. Plato didn't claim to have invented the story. He said it came from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians said it came from before their civilization. Now, most scholars dismiss the Atlantis story as allegory, and maybe it is, but maybe it's also a distorted memory, a story passed down through so many generations that the details got scrambled but the core truth remained. A great civilization, destroyed by catastrophe, lost beneath the sea. If that's true, then we're not pioneers. We're archaeologists of our own past. Every time we invent something new, we're just rediscovering something old. And that's not a bad thing. It means we have the potential within us. It means we've done this before. We can do it again. But it also means we need to be careful, because if the previous civilization fell, we can fall too. And the next time, there might not be anyone left to rebuild. The future, learning from a warning we don't remember. So what do we do with this? First, we keep looking. We fund marine archaeology. We use satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar and sonar to survey the continental shelves. We dig deeper into tell mounds. We study the precision of ancient stonework with modern engineering tools. We take the myths seriously as cultural memory rather than fantasy. Second, we prepare. The geological record tells us that the Earth goes through cycles of stability and catastrophe. We're currently in a stable period, but it won't last forever. Asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, rapid climate shifts, these are not hypotheticals. They're documented events that have happened before and will happen again. If we don't want to end up like the civilization before us, forgotten beneath the waves, we need to think long-term. We need to build things that will last. We need to encode our knowledge in ways that can survive catastrophe. We need to become the teachers that the survivors of the next reset will need. And third, we remember. We stop dismissing the stories. We stop assuming we're the first. We acknowledge that we're standing on the shoulders of giants we never knew existed. Because if we forget, we're doomed to repeat their mistakes. And if we remember, we have a chance to break the cycle. Conclusion, standing on a grave. So here's where we are. The evidence suggests that modern civilization is not the first time humans have reached this level of sophistication. It suggests that around 12,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened that reset the world. A cosmic impact, a flood, the collapse of societies that had existed for thousands of years. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, tried to preserve what they could. They taught the next generation. They built monuments meant to last. They encoded warnings in myths and stories. But over time, the memories faded. The teachers died. The knowledge fragmented. And we, the descendants, forgot. We forgot that we're standing on the ruins of something older. We forgot that the ground beneath our feet is layered with the remains of cities we never knew existed. We forgot that the flood myths aren't mythology, they're history. And now, 10,000 years later, we're starting to remember. We're finding the evidence, the stone blocks that shouldn't exist, the underwater structures, the patterns in the myths, the geological data that matches the stories. We're finding it because we're finally looking. And what we're finding suggests that we're not pioneers. We're inheritors. We're the latest chapter in a story that's far older and far more complex than we ever imagined. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? Do we keep building, keep advancing, keep pushing forward without looking back? Or do we take the time to learn from the world we've buried, to understand what happened to them so it doesn't happen to us? Because the evidence is clear. The Earth has reset before. It will reset again. And when it does, everything we've built, everything we think is permanent will be gone. Unless we learn, unless we prepare, unless we remember. That's the message buried in the stone. That's the warning encoded in the myths. We're not the first. We're the recovery. And if we're not careful, we'll just be the next layer in the Tell Mound. The next civilization buried beneath the one that comes after. So maybe it's time to start digging. Not just into the ground, but into our own history. Our real history. The one we forgot. Because somewhere beneath our feet, beneath the cities and the highways and the fields, there's a world waiting to be remembered. And it's trying to tell us something. If you want to keep going down this path, the next video digs into the evidence even deeper.